There are nights when your hands save lives, and then those same hands lead you to hell. Kaylin Mercer is the most talented surgeon in Southside Chicago. She doesn't need to know the patient's name. She doesn't need to know where they're from. She just needs a pulse, and her hands will do the rest. But tonight, the man on her operating table is no ordinary patient. And after she saves his life, her life will never be the same again. Like now and comment the city you're watching, so I know how far this story has come. Watch to the end, because tonight, the line between doctor and prisoner is thinner than a thread. The clock on the trauma bay wall read 3:17 a.m., and Kaylin Mercer had already been on her feet for 11 hours. Her lower back had stopped sending pain signals somewhere around hour 8. Her body's way of giving up protesting and just enduring. The fluorescent lights above Trauma Bay 2 hummed at a frequency that had burrowed into her skull like a drill bit. She was running on black coffee and the specific hollow determination of someone who had stopped counting what she was owed and started counting what she could still do. She was rewriting a chart at the nurse's station when the ambulance bay doors blew open. Not opened. Blew open, like something hit them from the outside with force and intention, the way a body hits a wall in a bad fall. 3 men came through first. Suits. Not hospital suits, not security uniforms. Tailored suits, the kind that cost more than Kaylin's monthly student loan payment, which was substantial. The kind that meant something. They were moving fast and carrying a 4th man between them, his arms draped over 2 of their shoulders, his feet dragging. The 4th man was bleeding, badly. The entry wound was somewhere below the left ribs, the blood soaking through a white dress shirt in an expanding bloom that looked almost black under the trauma bay lights. Kaylin was already moving before anyone called a code. "Get him on the table!" The 3 suited men didn't take direction from anyone. She could see that immediately, the way they held their posture even while hauling a half-conscious body. But they followed her, maybe because she didn't ask. She said it like a fact. The wounded man hit the gurney hard. He was tall, late 40s, with close-cropped dark hair gone silver at the temples, and a face that had the particular architecture of someone who had spent decades deciding things and being obeyed. Even barely conscious, jaw tight with pain, he had a stillness to him that wasn't weakness. It was controlled, like a man who had been hurt before and knew that screaming didn't help. Kaylin was already cutting his shirt open. "What's the caliber?" Silence. She looked up. The 3 men in suits stood in a loose triangle around the gurney, watching her with flat, measuring eyes. The biggest one, heavy set with a jaw like a cinder block, spoke first. "Does that matter?" "It matters if I want to know what I'm fishing for in his chest cavity, yes." She snapped on gloves and reached for the wound, palpating the tissue around the entry point. The man on the table hissed through his teeth, but didn't move. Entry wound, no exit, bullet still in there. Where did this happen? A location not relevant to his treatment. How long ago? A pause. 40 minutes. 40... She stopped herself. 40 minutes of blood loss from a wound this size. She pulled the overhead light down and leaned in, and what she saw made her go very still for exactly 1 second. The bullet had entered below the floating ribs and angled upward. Wrong trajectory, and it had nicked the diaphragm, possibly grazed the lower lobe of the left lung. He was breathing, but each breath was shorter than the last. She could see it in the subtle asymmetry of his chest. "I need to intubate and get him into surgery. Now!" She raised her voice without turning around. "I need a crash cart, 2 units O-neg, and someone get Dr. Reyes from cardiothoracic." "No." The word came from the man on the table. Kaylin stopped. She looked at him. His eyes were open, dark, very dark, focused on her with an intensity that was jarring given how much blood he'd lost. "No other doctors," he said. His voice was low, accented in some way she couldn't immediately place, clipped and precise even through the pain. "Just you." "Sir, I can't." "Just you." The big suited man stepped forward slightly, not threatening, exactly not threatening, in the way that very dangerous people sometimes calibrate their presence to send a message without doing anything technically aggressive. "He has specific requirements." Kaylin looked at the man on the table. She looked at the 3 men around him. She looked at the blood pooling against the gurney rail. She had been a trauma surgeon for 8 years. She had worked county hospitals. She had done a rotation in a conflict zone field hospital in Eastern Europe through a volunteer program her residency director had called career suicide. She knew what it looked like when men like this came into an emergency room. She knew what it meant. She also knew what it meant if she walked away. "I need to put him under," she said. "He can't be conscious for this." "No anesthesia," the man on the table said. "That's not a choice you get to." "It is." His eyes didn't leave her face. "I need to remain conscious. Is that something you can work around, doctor?" The way he said the last word, doctor, it wasn't a question. It was a test. She felt it land differently than it should have. Kaylin stood there for one breath. Two. Then she said, "Get everyone without a medical badge out of my trauma bay, including your people." The big man started to say something. "They can stand outside the glass. I don't care. But they don't stand over my shoulder while I operate or I walk, and he dies on this table, and that becomes your problem." She looked at him steadily. "Your choice." The three men exchanged glances. Some communication passed between them that had no words. Then the big man nodded, and they moved back, filing out through the doors, taking up positions just outside the bay where they were visible through the window. Kaylin exhaled slowly. She had a man on her table who had refused anesthesia, refused to give his name, refused to explain how he'd been shot or who had shot him. She had no surgical team she trusted, no attending she could call without this becoming something that got reported. She had her hands in her training and the fact that he was still breathing. She got to work. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. She worked with a nurse named Dora, who was 62 years old and had been in trauma nursing since before Kaylin was born, and who took one long look at the situation and said nothing, just moved to the instrument tray and started handing Kaylin what she needed before she asked. No questions. Dora had been around long enough to know that some nights you just kept your head down and did the work. The bullet had clipped the lower lobe of the left lung. Not catastrophically, but enough. Kaylin repaired it with a focused efficiency that cost her something she couldn't name, some reserve she'd been saving without knowing it. She sutured the diaphragm, controlled the bleeding, worked through the man's silent, controlled presence on the table while his vitals crawled in the wrong direction and then, grudgingly, climbed back. He never screamed. He made one sound, a sharp exhale through the nose when she was packing the cavity, and then he locked it down and was silent. She'd given him a local block where she could and told him when it was going to hurt. He'd nodded. His eyes had tracked the overhead light the whole time, distant and calculating, like he was doing math in his head. When it was done, she stripped her gloves and stood at the side of the gurney and looked at him. His color was still bad, but improving. His breathing had evened out. "You should have let me put you under," she said. "I needed to stay alert." His voice was thinner now, exhaustion bleeding through the control. "There are people who would use that window." She didn't ask what window. She understood, in the way you understand things in trauma medicine. Context from the shape of the injury, from the behavior, from the men outside the glass. "You need 3 days minimum of observation," she said. "The lung repair is solid, but infection risk, that will be handled." "By who? The men in the good suits?" Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. "You're very direct, doctor." "It's kept me employed." She looked at him levelly. "I'm going to need a name for the chart." "John." "Last name." "Does it matter?" She almost laughed. She didn't. "No, I suppose not tonight." She wrote John Doe. She'd written that before. She was finishing the chart at 6:04 a.m. when she realized the room was empty. She walked back to Trauma Bay 2 and the gurney was bare, the sheets stripped, the IV pole pushed aside. The window was empty. The men in the suits were gone. Somewhere in the building, a morning shift was arriving. Fluorescent lights were warming up. The day was starting. She went home. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in Logan Square that she could almost not afford. Student debt had made almost into a permanent way of living. She took the stairs because the elevator had been broken for 3 weeks, and the building management answered her emails with a specific kind of silence that she had come to understand as policy. She unlocked her door, dropped her bag, kicked off her shoes. She was thinking about the man's eyes, the way they'd tracked her, the particular quality of his attention, like he was cataloging everything. Not predatory, not threatening, just recording. The way a person looks when information is their primary currency. She was thinking about this when sleep hit her like a physical impact, and she didn't make it to the bedroom. She woke up on the couch at 2 p.m. to 3 missed calls from the hospital administrator, one from her student loan servicer, and the particular gray light of a Chicago afternoon that made everything look slightly defeated. She showered. She made coffee. She stood at her kitchen window and watched the street below for no reason she could name, just a low-level alertness that the morning hadn't fully shaken loose. She was on her second cup when her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. "The sutures will hold. You have good hands." She stared at it for a long time. Then she set the phone face down on the counter and drank her coffee and tried to convince herself that it was a compliment and nothing more. At 11:47 p.m. that night, her apartment door came off the hinges. She was asleep in her bed this time, actually in bed, the real sleep that her body had been demanding for days. She came awake to the sound of the impact, a single enormous concussive boom that her brain tried briefly to file as thunder before everything else caught up. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious, that trauma surgeon reflex of moving first and processing later. And she had 1 second of standing in her dark bedroom before the lights came on, and there were 4 men in her apartment. Same suits, different men. The one from the hospital wasn't among them. She didn't scream. She was beyond the fear response stage quickly, landing in a colder place. Assessment, calculation, the same gear shift she made when a patient coded unexpectedly. She looked at the 4 men. She looked at the door lying on her entryway floor. She looked at the window, 6 feet away, 4th floor. "That's a long way down," the nearest man said, not unkindly, like he'd seen her look at the window and was offering information. Kaylin breathed. Her hands were completely steady. She didn't know if that was courage or shock, and she didn't particularly care right now. "Where are you taking me?" she said. Not a question. Questions gave people something to dodge. She said it flat, like a line of information she expected to be filled in. The man with the non-unkind voice looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Somewhere you're needed, doctor." She looked around her apartment, at the books stacked on the shelf above the radiator, at the coffee mug she'd left on the counter, at the door lying on the floor. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had known this was coming. Not consciously. But that text at 2 p.m. had landed somewhere beneath language, in the part of the brain that tracks threat. "You have good hands." She put on shoes. She took her coat. She was not given a choice about the rest. The drive took just over an hour. She knew they'd left the city when the sound changed. No more traffic density, no more intersections, the particular acoustic shift of moving through open space in the dark. They'd put her in the back seat of an SUV with blacked-out windows, and she'd sat with her hands in her lap and thought, methodically, about what she knew and what she could leverage. She was a trauma surgeon. She had specific skills that were difficult to replace quickly. They hadn't hurt her. They hadn't restrained her beyond the implicit restraint of 4 men in a moving vehicle. They'd called her doctor. All of that was information. She was still assembling it when the car stopped, the door opened, and cold night air hit her face. She stepped out onto gravel and looked up. The building in front of her was massive. Not a house, not exactly an estate in the way that word usually meant, but something in between, something that had been designed with the explicit intention of looking like a fortress while maintaining enough polish to deny it. Stone walls, multiple outbuildings visible in the floodlights. The kind of security infrastructure that was meant to be seen because being seen was itself the message. A man she recognized was standing at the entrance, the big one, cinderblock jaw. He was holding the door open. "Mr. Voss is waiting," he said. Kaylin walked forward because the alternatives were limited. The inside of the building was warmer than she expected, warm in the way that places are when they're genuinely lived in, not just maintained. The hallways had art on the walls, actual art, not prints. There were books on shelves in the room she was walked through, their spines worn. She cataloged these details automatically because details were how she understood environments, and she needed to understand this one. They took her to a room on the 2nd floor. It was set up like a medical suite. Not a hospital room, nothing that crude, but clearly arranged by someone who knew what a recovery room needed. IV stand. Equipment she recognized. Clean lines and a hospital smell that had been imperfectly masked by something that might have been cedar. The man from the trauma bay was in the bed. He looked worse. In the better light, with the specific pallor of someone fighting early-stage infection, he looked like what he was. A man who had lost a significant amount of blood and was now being asked to recover in a location that was not a hospital. His eyes were open when she came in. "Dr. Mercer," he said. She stopped in the doorway. She looked at him. She looked at the equipment around him. She looked at the door behind her, which the big man was not closing, but also not moving away from. "You know my name," she said. "I do." A pause. "You knew the risk when you signed the chart." She had. She hadn't admitted it to herself, but she had. John Doe. She could have called security after they left. She hadn't. "What's the infection status?" she asked. Because there was a man who needed medical attention in front of her, and the rest of it, all of it, would have to wait. "Fever spiked to 104 this afternoon. The men I have here are capable, but they're not surgeons." She crossed the room and picked up the chart they'd assembled. Handwritten, incomplete, but organized by someone with some training. She read it. "You've been running antibiotics?" "What we had access to." "Which was?" He named them. She made a sound in her throat that wasn't quite approval. "You need a broader spectrum coverage, and the wound needs to be examined for early necrotic tissue. If we're lucky, we caught it before it progressed." She set down the chart. "Mr. Voss?" He looked at her. "I want to be very clear about something," Kaylin said. Her voice was level and even and completely without performance. "I'm going to provide you with medical care because you need it, and because I took an oath that doesn't come with a clause for situations I find morally complicated. But I'm not your employee and I'm not your prisoner, and when you are stable, I am leaving." He watched her for a moment, the same quality of attention he'd had on the trauma table, cataloging. "That's a reasonable position," he said finally. She pulled on gloves. She was leaning over the wound, examining the suture line under good light, when he spoke again, quietly, almost to himself. "The men who shot me, they know you saved my life. They know what you look like." Kaylin's hands didn't stop moving. "And," she said, "and your apartment isn't safe anymore." A pause. "It may not have been safe since this morning." She kept working. She didn't look up. She felt the information settle into the cold calculus she'd been running since the moment her door came off the hinges. When she finally spoke, her voice was the same as it always was in the OR. Flat, precise, without emotional weather. "Then we have a problem," she said. She pressed carefully along the suture line and felt the heat of early infection beneath her fingers. And somewhere in the building a door opened and closed, and the night outside the windows of Blackwood Estate was completely, absolutely silent. And Kaylin understood, with the finality of a diagnosis you can't take back, that she was no longer a visitor here. She found the necrotic tissue at the wound's southern edge, a patch the size of a thumbnail, grayish and wrong against the healthy red of the surrounding muscle. Not catastrophic, caught early enough. But early enough only meant that whoever had been managing his care in the hours since the ER had missed it, and missing it for another 12 hours would have meant a different conversation entirely. She debrided it without ceremony. He didn't make a sound. "You've had medical staff here," she said, not looking up from the wound. "They missed this. They're soldiers with field training. Field training doesn't cover surgical site monitoring." She packed the area with fresh gauze and reached for the irrigation syringe. "How many people in this building have actual medical credentials?" A pause. "Now? 1. She let that land without comment and kept working. The room was quiet except for the sound of the equipment and the occasional shift of weight from the doorway, where the big man, she'd heard someone call him Gregor, maintained his position with the particular stillness of a person who had learned to stand for long periods in uncomfortable places. When she'd finished redressing the wound, she stripped her gloves and stood and looked at the IV setup. The fluid rate was wrong. Too slow. She adjusted it, checked the antibiotic drip, made a notation on the handwritten chart. "You need to sleep," she said. "I need a status report from my people." "You need to sleep," she said again in exactly the same tone. "The fever will peak in the next 6 hours. If you're conscious for all of it, you'll make decisions you shouldn't be making, and whatever you're managing will go worse, not better. 6 hours. Then you get your status report. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She'd had this conversation with high-functioning people before. Executives, athletes, once a sitting federal judge who'd come in with a ruptured appendix and tried to take a call from his clerk while she was prepping him for surgery. The conversation always went the same way. He closed his eyes. Gregor showed her to a room down the hall. It was larger than she expected and furnished with the same particular taste that characterized the rest of the building. Not ostentatious, but deliberate. Everything chosen. She stood in the middle of it for a moment, looking at the window. Heavy curtains. She pulled one aside. Beyond the glass, floodlights illuminated a stretch of lawn that ended at a wall, and beyond the wall was dark nothing. No city lights, no road visible. She let the curtain fall. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. Steady. They were always steady during the work, and then afterward sometimes her body sent her the bill. A faint tremor, a sudden awareness of how tired she was. She waited for it. It didn't come. She was too far past tired for tremors. She was in the flat gray country beyond exhaustion where everything just felt remote and slightly unreal. She lay back on top of the covers without undressing and stared at the ceiling and thought about the infection trajectory, about the antibiotic coverage she'd requested and whether they could actually source it, about the suture line and the debridement site, and eventually her mind drifted and she slept. She woke up to voices in the hallway. Not loud voices. That was almost worse. They were being deliberately kept low, which meant whoever was speaking knew she was there and was making choices about what she should and shouldn't hear. She lay still and listened. She could make out Gregor's voice, lower and slower. Another voice, younger, with a sharp precision to it that cut through the wall better. She couldn't get words, just rhythm and tone, and the tone was wrong, too tight, the kind of conversation where both people are controlling something. She got up, she went to the door and opened it before she could second-guess the impulse. The hallway had 3 people in it. Gregor, a man she hadn't seen before, younger, sharp-featured, wearing a suit that was somehow even better than Gregor's, and a woman in tactical clothing who was holding a tablet and looking at it with an expression that suggested the tablet was delivering bad news. The sharp-featured man looked at her. His eyes were light-colored, blue or gray in the hallway light, and they moved over her with the speed and impersonality of a security camera. "Dr. Mercer," he said, "you should be resting." "I was." She looked at Gregor. "What time is it?" 4:30. She'd been asleep 3 hours. "How's his temperature?" 103.2. "Coming down. Good." She looked at the sharp-featured man. "And you are?" A brief pause. The kind that wasn't hesitation but performance. Someone deciding what to give her. Lucien Vale. "I'm Adrian's cousin." He said it with a particular weight, cousin, like the word was a title rather than a relationship. "I oversee operations while he's incapacitated." "He's not incapacitated. He's recovering from surgery." "There's a difference." Something moved in Vale's expression. Very small, very fast. "Of course," he said, and the smoothness of it was so complete it was almost impressive. Kaylin looked at Gregor. Gregor was looking at a point slightly above Vale's left shoulder, which she recognized as the look of someone maintaining a position by looking at everything except the thing they were actually watching. She went to check on her patient. Adrian's fever had broken by morning. She found him sitting partially upright when she came in at 7, which was not what she'd left him doing and not what he should have been doing, and she said so. "The incision pulls when you're at that angle." "I'm aware." "Then lie back." "I've been lying back for 9 hours." "You'll be lying back for several more days if you want the repair to hold." She moved to the bedside and checked his pulse, his color. Better. The specific gray of serious infection had receded to something closer to normal. "When did the fever break?" "Around 3. So before her conversation in the hallway, she noted that he'd been awake, or close enough, while she'd been sleeping. She wondered what he'd heard through the walls and from whom. She did the examination in silence for a moment. He let her, which she appreciated. "Your cousin was here last night," she said. Adrian's breathing didn't change. Nothing about him changed, but the quality of the air in the room shifted in some way she couldn't have put into language. I know. He has good suits. He does. She pressed carefully along the wound margin. He looked at me like I was a problem he was calculating. Adrian's eyes moved to her face. He had the kind of eyes that were difficult to read, not because they were blank, but because they were full of something old and layered that she kept catching the edge of without being able to see the whole. You are a problem he's calculating, he said. So am I. She looked at him. Lucien, he said carefully, has certain ambitions that require me to remain unavailable. He said it flat, without drama, the way you discuss a weather system, as a condition rather than a betrayal. He arranged the shooting. Not a question. She'd assembled it sometime in the night, in the space between sleep and waking where the brain keeps working. He didn't confirm or deny it. What he said was, the men who shot me were not from an outside organization. That was enough. She went to the window. Outside, morning was arriving gray and slow over the estate grounds. 2 men were visible on the perimeter, moving the way security moves. Not hurried, but with the particular alertness that never completely switches off. She watched them for a moment. What does he want? She asked. What people like Lucien always want, the chair at the head of the table. A pause. And no one in that chair when he arrives. And you think he knows you know. Lucien is intelligent. Intelligent people assume the worst because the worst is usually accurate. She turned from the window. So the people in this building, most are loyal. Some I'm not certain of. He met her eyes steadily. Which is why I need to be standing before he understands the degree of my recovery. You're a week from standing. I have perhaps 4 days. She opened her mouth. I understand my own timeline better than the fever suggests, Dr. Mercer. I've operated under worse conditions than this. You've operated, past tense. This is you recovering from operating, which is different, and the body doesn't care how high your pain tolerance is when we're talking about internal sutures and infection load. She crossed her arms. 4 days gets you out of bed. That's it. 4 days does not get you running an organization. Then I'll do it from bed. She stared at him for a moment. Then she said, I need more supplies. What you have here is enough to manage the immediate situation, not enough for a full recovery protocol. Give Gregor a list. Gregor can source surgical supplies? Gregor can source most things. She believed that. She picked up the chart, added her notes, set it back down. At the door, she stopped. The people you're not certain about, she said. Are any of them responsible for my care? He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Something that might have been, in a different person, something close to discomfort. I'll have that corrected, he said. The day passed in the specific way that days pass inside contained spaces, too slowly and then suddenly in chunks, time moving wrong without the normal markers of it. Kaylin established a routine because routines kept her functional. Check Adrian at 7, noon, and 6. Manage the antibiotic administration. Monitor the wound. Between those intervals, she mapped the building, not covertly. She didn't have the training for covert, and trying would have been obvious. She just walked. She said she needed to move after long periods of sitting and nobody stopped her, which was itself information. She went down hallways and noted doors and the people near them. She found a kitchen and a woman named Petra who ran it with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing exactly this job for a very long time. Petra gave her coffee without being asked, which she took as a good sign. She found a library that appeared to be actually used. The books weren't arranged decoratively. They were arranged by interest, well-read, some of them marked with slips of paper. Military history. Economic theory. A significant section on shipping and maritime law. Several novels in languages other than English. She was pulling one of the shipping law texts from the shelf when she heard footsteps and turned to find Vale in the doorway. He moved into the room the way he did everything, with a smoothness that was too complete, like something rehearsed until it looked natural. He looked at the book in her hands with light, almost amused eyes. Doing research, he said. Bored, she said. Surgery keeps the hands busy. Long recoveries don't. He moved to the other side of the room and sat down in a leather chair with the ease of someone in his own house, which, she understood, he perhaps believed it to be. "How is my cousin?" he asked. "Improving." "Good." The word landed wrong, not too fast, not too slow, calibrated. His health is a priority for all of us. "I'm sure it is." Vale looked at her for a moment. He had the kind of face that was handsome in a way that didn't quite land, too symmetrical, too finished, like a photograph of a face rather than one. "You're very direct," he said. "So I've been told." Adrian trusts direct people. A pause. "He also tends to make problems out of them." She looked at him. "Is that a warning?" "It's an observation." He tilted his head slightly. "You're a trauma surgeon from the south side of Chicago. Whatever you think you understand about the situation you're in, I'd encourage you to think further." She set the book back on the shelf. "Mr. Vale, I'm going to be straightforward with you because straightforward is the only register I have. I'm here to keep a patient alive. That's my entire agenda. I don't have a position in whatever is happening between you and your cousin, and I don't want one." Vale watched her for a long moment. Then he smiled, not warmly, but with a kind of acknowledgement. "That's a very healthy attitude," he said. "I hope you can maintain it." He left. She stood in the library and listened to his footsteps recede down the hallway, and her pulse was elevated, and she acknowledged that quietly and let it settle. That evening, when she went to check Adrian's sutures, she found two men in the room who hadn't been there before. They stood on opposite sides of the bed with the specific positioning of people who had not arrived to provide medical assistance. Adrian was awake and watching her come in with the same calibrated stillness. "Gregor's been reassigned," he said before she could ask. She looked at the two men. They looked back. "By whom?" she said. Adrian's jaw tightened, the first visible sign of anger she'd seen from him. "By someone who understood that my primary security would be a vulnerability." She moved to the bedside and began the examination with her back deliberately to the two men because showing that they made her nervous would be a disadvantage, and she had few enough advantages as it was. "The antibiotic drip needs to be changed," she said, quietly enough that it was between them. "I know. I need Gregor to get supplies. Some of what I asked for still hasn't arrived." "I know that too." She leaned in slightly under the pretense of examining the wound site. "How bad is it?" she said very quietly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, so low she almost missed it. "Two captains stopped answering last night. One safe house went dark. There are 15 men in this building I'd stake my life on." He paused. 12 fewer than yesterday." She straightened up and made a notation on the chart without letting anything show on her face. 15 men. Against whatever Lucian had been assembling for however long it had taken him to plan a thing like this. She finished the examination. She administered the medication. She was at the door when he said her name, her actual name, not doctor, just Kaylin, the first time she'd heard it from him. She stopped. "The two men by the bed," he said. "They're Lucien's." She didn't turn around. Her hand was on the doorframe and she held onto it for exactly 1 second. "How long have they been in this building?" "Long enough." She walked out. She walked down the hallway toward her room. Her mind was very clear, the way it got in the worst moments in the OR when clarity was the only option. All the noise burned away, just the problem and the variables and what she could actually do. She'd been thinking of herself as trapped. That framing was wrong. Trapped implied the threat was external, but the threat had just moved inside the walls. She was 2 doors from her room when she heard it, a sound that didn't fit the building's rhythm. Something below. A door opened and closed quickly, then voices, more of them than made sense for the middle of the night, and the specific quality of tension that fills air before something physical happens. She turned and went toward the sound instead of away from it. Later, she would not be able to explain why, only that moving toward the problem was what her body knew how to do. At the top of the main staircase, she looked down into the entry hall. 8 men she didn't recognize were standing inside the front door, which was open. Lucien Vale was standing in front of them. He was still in his excellent suit. He was speaking quietly to one of them, unhurried, like a man discussing a plan he'd already finalized. He had the relaxed posture of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment, and was watching it arrive on schedule. He looked up. He saw her. For one frozen second, they looked at each other across the staircase. The doctor from the south side of Chicago, and the man with his cousin's blood on his hands. And Vale's expression did something she hadn't seen it do before. It went completely still. Then he said quietly to the men around him, "She goes with Mercer. No harm. She's leverage." Kaylin turned and ran. Her feet hit the hallway carpet, and she was calculating as she moved. Adrian's room, 50 feet ahead, the two men inside it, who were Lucien's, the window at the end of the hall that she'd measured with her eyes that morning out of the habit of measuring exits, the drop to the ground she'd estimated at 20 feet onto stone and then grass. She was running the numbers as she ran, and none of them were good. She hit Adrian's door and went through it without knocking, and the two men by the bed turned, and she didn't stop moving. She crossed the room to the window, got her hands on the frame. "Stop!" Adrian's voice, sharp and commanding, and she stopped. Not because she was obeying him, but because the window looked down onto the approach lane and 3 more vehicles were pulling up it now, their headlights cutting through the dark. She turned. The two men were between her and the door. Adrian was sitting up in bed, a thing that was pulling his sutures and that he was ignoring, and in his right hand was a gun she had not known was in the room. He was pointing it at the two men. "How many?" he said to her, without taking his eyes off them. "8 that I saw. Vale was with them." Her voice was steady. She couldn't decide if that was good or terrifying. "More outside." The two men looked at each other. One of them went for the door. The gun fired, and the sound of it in the enclosed room was enormous. And then the man was on the floor, not moving, and the other man had his hands up, and Adrian was breathing through the pain of the movement it had cost him, his face the color of ash, the suture line probably compromised, and Kaylin understood in the precise, pitiless way that the worst moments always arrived, that she had not been in a complicated situation. She had been in a war, and she had just chosen a side. The man on the floor wasn't dead. Kaylin knew it before she crossed the room, the way he'd fallen, the position of the wound, high on the shoulder and through clean, the blood loss significant but not the kind that ended things in the first 30 seconds. She knew it, and she went to him anyway because that was what her hands did. They moved toward damage, and she was on her knees applying pressure before she'd made a conscious decision to do it. "He's alive," she said. "I know," Adrian said. He was watching the door. The gun was still up. The second man, hands raised, back against the wall, was looking at his partner on the floor with an expression she recognized as someone recalculating the cost of their choices in real time. "How many men can you reach right now?" Kaylin said to Adrian. Not asked, said, the same way she ran a trauma bay. Declarative, directional, no space for ambiguity. "Damon's on the east corridor, 2 more on the lower level if Lucian hasn't moved on them yet." He shifted his weight, and she heard the breath he controlled, the suture line pulling, the infection site protesting the movement. He was running on adrenaline and fury, and neither of those were going to last. "You need to sit down." "I need to not be dead." "Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Sit down." She kept pressure on the man's shoulder with one hand and looked up at Adrian. "You tear those sutures open fully, you'll bleed into the cavity again. Do you understand what I'm telling you? It won't be slow." He looked at her. Something passed through his expression, not fear exactly, but a recognition of the variable she was describing. He sat on the edge of the bed. The gun didn't move. She looked at the standing man. "What's your name?" He blinked. "What?" "Your name. I'm going to need to know it if I'm going to keep your partner from bleeding out, and you're going to need to give me something if you want that to happen." A long pause. "Reeves. Reeves. Get me towels from that bathroom. Now. Move slowly." He moved slowly. He got the towels. He handed them over with the careful movements of someone who understood that the situation had reorganized itself and was still working out where he stood in the new version. She packed the wound more efficiently. The man on the floor, she didn't have his name yet, was conscious, barely, making the sounds of someone in significant pain who had decided that making sounds was permissible now that options had narrowed. From somewhere below them, she heard something. A door. Then voices, sharp and overlapping. Then a sound that her brain processed a half-second late as a gunshot, muffled by floors and walls. Then another. Adrian was already moving toward the door. Don't. Damon's on that floor. Flat, decisive. He reached the door and looked back at Reeves. You. Stay in this room. You move, you follow us, I find out about it. You understand what happens. Reeves nodded. He looked like a man who had become very clear about several things very quickly. Adrian looked at Kaylin. She was on her feet, hands still bloody, looking at him with an expression she hoped communicated what she needed it to without words. He handed her a knife from the back of his waistband. Folded, tactical, the kind that opened with one hand. She looked at it. I'm a surgeon, she said. Right now you're a person in a building under assault. He met her eyes. Don't use it unless you need to, but know how. She took it. They moved into the hallway. The building had changed. The same walls, the same art, the same carpet. But the quality of the air was different. The way the air changes in a hospital when a code is running. Everyone's nervous system attuned to a different frequency. At the far end of the hall, a door was open that had been closed before, and through it she could see the flicker of a light source that wasn't a lamp. Adrian moved the way she wouldn't have expected a man 4 days out of trauma surgery to move. Low, deliberate, conserving momentum. She stayed close. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears, but her hands were the same as they always were, and she was grateful for that in a remote, almost academic way. They found Damon at the top of the east staircase. He was alive. He'd taken something across the side of the head. Not a bullet, blunt impact, a pistol whip, or worse. And he was sitting against the wall with his hand pressed to his temple and blood running freely through his fingers. He looked up when Adrian appeared, and something in his face went loose with relief. East entry's breached, he said. 6 of them, maybe 7. Lucien's people. I recognized 2 from the Meridian operation. He stopped, swallowed. They took the server room. Adrian went very still. The drives, he said. I don't know. I was hit before. The drives, Damon. Damon looked at him, and the look said everything. Adrian's jaw tightened to the point where she could see the muscle working beneath the skin. Kaylin crouched beside Damon and looked at the head wound. Not arterial. Significant, but manageable. She used the hem of her sleeve. She'd stopped caring about the clothes somewhere in the last 12 hours, and applied direct pressure. Hold this, she told Damon. He raised his own hand to replace hers, pressed hard. She looked up at Adrian. What's on the drives? A beat of silence. Everything, he said. The word landed like a weight dropped from a height. Documentation. The trafficking network. Names, routes, payment chains, contacts within the Port Authority, within city contracts. 3 years of intelligence. He paused. The material I plan to use to dismantle the operation from the inside before transferring it to federal contacts. She stared at him. You were building a case. I was building leverage. The distinction matters. He turned away from her and looked down the staircase, calculating something she couldn't see. If Lucien delivers that material to the network rather than destroying it, they'll use it to bury everyone on it before a prosecution can begin. Every name I've documented, every location. Including your contacts. Including people who trusted me with information that could get them killed. He said it without inflection, like reading a damage report. But something underneath it, she caught it. The particular flatness of someone carrying weight they've stopped being able to put down. From below, closer now, she heard footsteps. Multiple sets. Adrian straightened. He looked at Damon. Can you move? Yes? Then move. He looked at Kaylin. There's a room below the kitchen, sublevel. Nobody outside of this building's original construction knows it's there. A panic room. A contingency. He was already moving. Come. She came. They went down a back staircase that smelled of stone and age, a service route that had been built into the house's bones and then largely forgotten. Damon was behind her, one hand still on his temple, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a concussion. Adrian was ahead, one hand on the wall. She watched his other hand and could see in the tension of it the effort he was making to not acknowledge what the movement was costing him. The kitchen was empty. Petra was gone, sensibly, wherever the staff had gone when the building changed. The overhead lights were still on, and the incongruity of it, the normalcy of a lit kitchen in the middle of this, hit her for a moment with a specific absurdity before she pushed it aside. Adrian went to the back wall, a section of paneling. She watched his hands work a mechanism she couldn't see from her angle, and then a section of wall moved inward and cool, slightly damp air came out of the dark. They went in. He pulled it closed behind them. The room beyond was not what she expected. Not a closet, not a cramped shelter. Maybe 400 square feet, reinforced walls, a generator that hummed quietly, overhead lights that came on automatically when they entered. A cot. A first aid kit mounted on the wall, substantial, almost a field kit. A landline phone. A monitor showing a rotating series of security feeds, some dark now, others still showing hallways and exterior angles. She went to the first aid kit immediately. She pulled it open and took a real inventory for the first time, and felt something ease in her chest at what she found. Whoever had stocked it had known what they were doing. Not a hospital, not anywhere close, but enough. She turned to Damon first. Sit. He sat. She examined the head wound under the room's clean light. Laceration, 4 centimeters, nothing structural below. She palpated carefully, and he winced, but his pupils were even and tracking. She irrigated and closed it with the suture kit, working fast and clean, and he sat for it without complaint, which gave her a revised opinion of Damon. Adrian had gone directly to the monitor. He was standing in front of it, studying the feeds, and she could see from his posture that what he was seeing was bad. She finished with Damon and moved to stand beside him. The feeds that were still live showed the upper floors. She could see Lucien's people moving through hallways with the organized efficiency of a search. Not panicked, not rushed, systematic. They were looking for something, or someone. They haven't found this room, she said. They won't. Not immediately. He pointed to one feed, the room she'd been sleeping in. 2 men were inside it, going through the small number of her possessions. They know you're not where you should be. Because I'm leverage. Yes. She watched the men on the feed and felt a particular cold anger that was different from fear, cleaner, more useful. She filed it and turned to the problem. The drives, she said. Can you access anything from here? The server room is air-gapped. There's no remote access. His voice was controlled, too controlled. If they have the drives, they have them. What do they do with them? He turned from the monitor. He looked at her, and for the first time since the trauma table at St. Vincent's, she saw something in his face that wasn't calculation or control. It was closer to devastation, the specific devastation of someone watching years of work dissolve. He covered it in about 2 seconds, but she'd seen it. They deliver them to the network's administrative council, he said. Within 48 hours, every person I've documented goes underground or gets eliminated. Every trafficking route I've mapped relocates. 3 years of work becomes a liability list that gets people killed. Damon said from the cot. There might be a copy. They both looked at him. He pressed his hand to his forehead, grimacing. The Meridian copies. Before the server room was fully built out, you ran a secondary. Voss, you put copies on the Meridian transfer accounts. I moved data there for you twice. If Lucien doesn't know about Meridian, he doesn't, Adrian said, slowly, like he was checking it against something internal. That account was compartmentalized. It wasn't on any internal documentation. He was quiet for a moment. If the copies are intact, do they help? Kaylin said. If you can't get to them, do they help? I have a contact, he said. Federal level, off book. Someone who has been waiting for this material for 8 months. If I can reach them with access credentials, they can pull the Meridian files independently. He looked at the landline phone. But a call from this number right now in this situation gets traced, Damon said. Gets traced, he agreed, and puts the contact at risk. Kaylin was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the first aid kit. She was thinking about the suture line and the infection site, and the way Adrian had moved on the staircase, the cost of it, visible in every careful step. She was thinking about the drives and the names on them, and the specific category of harm that trafficking networks did when left operational. She was thinking about the man she'd written as John Doe on a chart 4 days ago. How long can we stay in here before they find a way in? She said. Adrian looked at the door. The mechanism. 12 hours, maybe. If they bring the right equipment, less. And your 15 men, the ones you trust. 7, as of the last count I had. The others, he stopped. 7 against what's upstairs. Against what's upstairs, yes, which is not math that works in our favor. He sat down. She watched the decision, the acknowledgement of what his body was telling him, and it cost him something to make it. He sat on the edge of the cot and put one hand flat on the wall beside him, steadying. She crossed the room and crouched in front of him. She looked at the wound site through his shirt. She could see the stain spreading where the suture line had been stressed. Not catastrophic. Not yet. She looked up at his face. "I'm going to tell you something medical," she said, "and I need you to actually hear it." He looked at her. The steadiness of him. Even now. Even here. It was one of the stranger things she'd encountered in a career full of strange human behavior under pressure. The infection is responding to treatment. The suture line is compromised at the inferior margin. Maybe 2, 3 sutures have pulled. If you keep moving the way you were moving upstairs, that becomes more sutures. And then we're not talking about a repair, we're talking about a reopening that I cannot manage in this room with this equipment. She held his gaze. You have to let your body do some of the work. There are people in my house trying to I know what they're doing. I also know that you're useless to your 7 men dead. She didn't soften it. Rest for 2 hours. Let me re-examine the site. Then we make whatever plan we're going to make. He was quiet. The generator hummed. On the monitor, Lucien's people continued their systematic search of a building they thought they controlled. 2 hours, he said. She worked on the wound site in silence. He sat for it without flinching, which she'd come to understand was simply who he was. The pain existed. He acknowledged it internally. He did not perform it. She'd operated on men who screamed at a blood pressure cuff and men who'd taken shrapnel without making a sound. And the difference was never toughness. It was always about how someone related to their own body. When she was done, she sat on the floor beside the cot, the only available real estate, and looked at the security monitor. Damon had fallen into the specific horizontal stillness of a concussion patient who'd been told to stay still, which was the right call. Adrian had closed his eyes. She watched the feeds. On the 3rd rotation of the monitor, she saw something. She leaned forward. Feed 7, the main entry hall, wide angle. Lucien was there with 2 of his men. He was on a phone call. She couldn't hear anything through the monitor, but she could read body language, and his was telling her something specific. He was not searching. He was waiting, which meant he knew something she didn't. She looked at the feed for a long time. Then she looked at the landline phone. Then she looked at Adrian, eyes closed, chest rising and falling with the careful rhythm of someone managing pain in sleep. She looked back at the monitor. Lucien ended his call. He put the phone in his jacket pocket with the satisfied movement of someone who had just received information they were expecting. He looked up, and even through the wide-angle security feed, even at that resolution, she had the irrational and specific sensation that he was looking directly at the camera. Then he looked at the man beside him and said something, and the man nodded and left the frame at a pace that was not searching pace. It was approach pace. Kaylin stood up. Her legs were steady, her mind was very clear. She crossed to Adrian and put her hand on his shoulder, and he came awake immediately. Not the slow surfacing of normal sleep, but the instant alertness of someone who had spent a long time sleeping in conditions where immediate alertness was a survival requirement. He looked at her. "He knows where we are," she said. Adrian's eyes went to the monitor, came back to her. She watched him run the calculation, all the variables, all the implications, and complete it in about 4 seconds. "Reeves," he said. The man they'd left in the room upstairs, hands raised, cooperating, given nothing to cooperate with, except the knowledge that they'd gone down, that they'd gone toward the kitchen. Adrian's eyes went to Damon. "How many sutures did she put in your head?" Damon blinked, processing the apparent non sequitur. 6. "Can you function?" "I can function." "Then we're out of time." He stood. She didn't try to stop him. She handed him the gun from the floor where he'd set it. She'd picked it up at some point without thinking about it, and he took it and checked it with the automatic movements of someone for whom checking a weapon is as reflexive as checking a pulse is for her. He looked at her. The security feeds cast moving light across his face. "There's another way out of this room," he said. "Tunnel, runs about 60 meters, exits behind the north outbuilding. I want you in that tunnel." "And you?" "Damon and I will—" "I heard what I asked," she said. "I asked what happens to you." He looked at her for a moment. Outside the panic room, somewhere in the building, she heard a sound. Low, deliberate. The sound of something mechanical being applied to a door. "I need to reach my contact," he said. "There's a secondary phone in the tunnel box. Encrypted. One-time use. If I can get you the Meridian credentials, you can make the call yourself. You're not on any of their lists. You're a civilian. They won't— They already called me leverage. Leverage is valuable. They won't hurt you until I'm dead." He said it without any particular emotion, the way she said the infection is responding, as medical fact. "Which means you have a window." She looked at him. She thought about the drives and the names and the routes and the 3 years of work that was either destroyed or wasn't. She thought about a federal contact waiting 8 months for a call. She thought about what leverage meant to men like Lucien Vale and how long the window he was describing actually lasted. She thought about what she'd said when she first walked into this room. "When you are stable, I am leaving." She looked at the door of the panic room, where the mechanical sound was getting closer, more purposeful. Someone who knew what they were looking for and had found it, and was now working the problem. She looked at Adrian. "Give me the credentials," she said, "and tell me everything I need to say when they answer." He held her gaze for 1 second. 2. Then something in his face, underneath all the control, underneath all the calculation, shifted, like a door opening in a room that had been locked for a very long time. He told her. She memorized it the way she memorized drug interactions and dosage weights, fast, precise, permanent. She was good at holding information in conditions that made other people drop it. It was one of the reasons she was a good surgeon. He moved to the tunnel entrance at the back of the room and opened it. Another panel, another mechanism, the building's bones full of contingencies, and cold air came out of the dark again. She looked at Damon. "Don't let him reopen the wound." Damon almost smiled. Almost. "I'll do my best, Doc." She looked at Adrian. He was looking back at her with the specific expression of someone who has very few things left to say and no time to say them and knows it. She went into the tunnel. The darkness closed around her and she moved forward, because forward was the only direction, and the credentials were locked in her memory, and the phone was somewhere ahead, in a box in the dark, and 60 meters felt like a mile. But she kept moving, kept her hand on the rough tunnel wall, kept breathing in the cold underground air. And behind her, muffled by distance and concrete and 60 meters of earth, she heard the panic room door finally give. The tunnel was 60 meters of cold and dark, and the smell of old earth, and she counted every step. Not because counting helped, because her brain needed something to do that wasn't imagining what was happening behind the door she'd just heard give way. Counting kept the imaging at bay. 1, 2, 3. Her left hand on the rough concrete wall, her right hand holding the tactical knife Adrian had given her, open now, because the dark felt like the kind of dark that rewarded having something in your hand. 41, 42. The wall curved slightly right, and she followed it. 58, 59, 60. Her hand hit wood. A door. A handle. She found it by feel, turned it, pushed, and cold outside air hit her face along with the particular smell of wet grass and lake wind and the specific quality of pre-dawn dark that was different from the dark inside. She stood in the gap and let her eyes adjust. The north outbuilding was 10 feet to her left. Beyond it, a stretch of open ground before the perimeter wall. The floodlights that had been burning when she arrived were off on this side. Deliberately, she understood, by someone who had thought about exits. Adrian had thought about exits. The tunnel box was mounted inside the door frame. She felt for it, found it, pried it open. Inside, the phone, a folded paper with a frequency written on it, and a small flashlight. She took all 3. She turned the flashlight on low and looked at the phone. Encrypted, single use, a number already loaded. She pressed call. It rang 4 times. 5. Her jaw was tight, and she made herself unclench it because tension in the jaw meant tension in the hands, and she needed her hands steady. 6. Someone picked up. Silence on the line first. Not dead air, but listening silence. The kind that meant someone was there and waiting for a specific thing before speaking. She said the first credential string Adrian had given her. 12 characters, alphanumeric, exactly as he'd spoken it in the panic room. More silence. Then a voice. Male, flat, the particular vocal quality of someone who had learned to strip all identifiable characteristics from their speech. Verify secondary. She gave the second string, a pause that lasted long enough for her heart to beat 6 times. She counted those too. Location, the voice said. Blackwood Estate. North Perimeter. I have access to the Meridian files. I need you to pull them independently, tonight. There's a 48-hour window before they're either destroyed or weaponized by the network. She paused. The man who built this case is in that building right now, and I don't know what his status is. Another pause. Who are you? I'm his doctor, she said. And for the first time since any of this began, that sentence felt like something more than a professional designation. Stand by, the voice said. She stood by. She stood in the opening of a tunnel behind a building on an estate outside Chicago in the dark of 4 a.m. with a tactical knife in one hand and an encrypted phone in the other, and she stood by. 90 seconds passed. We have the Meridian access. Files are pulling now. A beat. Dr. Mercer. She went still at the use of her name. You should move away from that building, the voice said. We're going to have a significant federal presence at that location within the hour. She looked back at the tunnel entrance. I have a patient in there, she said. A pause that might have been human. Doctor, within the hour, she said. Understood. She ended the call. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to acknowledge what she was about to do and why. And then she went back into the tunnel. The door to the panic room was open when she reached it, hanging off one hinge. The room inside was wrong. The cot overturned, the first aid kit pulled from the wall, the security monitor dark. No Damon, no Adrian. Blood on the floor near the entrance, a smear of it. Someone moved in a hurry. Not a killing amount of blood. She knew killing amounts. She stood in the doorway and listened. From above her, through the floor, through the old bones of the building. She could hear it. Movement. Multiple people, converging. And beneath it, something percussive, the specific sound she'd been filing incorrectly as distant impact and now correctly identified as gunfire. She went up. The kitchen was still lit, still empty, Petra's coffee still on the warmer from hours ago. She moved through it fast, past the overturned stool someone had knocked on their way through, past the spilled glass on the floor, toward the sound. She came out into the main corridor and nearly walked into a man she didn't recognize. He saw her at the same time. She moved first, not thought, just the body acting on information the brain was still processing, drove her elbow into his throat the way she'd been taught in a self-defense class 8 years ago that she'd attended for 3 sessions before her schedule made it impossible. And apparently 3 sessions was enough because he went down hard and she was past him before he'd finished falling. The corridor opened into the main hall and she stopped at the edge of it. Chaos had a shape. She'd learned that in trauma work. Even the worst code had a structure if you knew how to read it. She read this one in about 2 seconds. 6 men that she could see, minimum, in tactical positions around the hall's perimeter. Return fire from the east corridor controlled. 2 shooters holding a position. And in the center of the hall, being moved by 2 of Lucien's people with the specific efficiency of asset transport rather than prisoner transport, was Adrian. He was vertical, barely. His left arm across one of the men's shoulders, his right hand pressed flat against his own abdomen. She could see the blood from here, dark through the fabric, the suture line. Not the slow seep of stress damage. Something worse. He'd been hit. Not by a bullet. She processed this quickly, reading his movement, the angle of his hand. Something blunt, something that had impacted the surgical site directly. His face was the color of old concrete, and he was moving through what she recognized as the specific override state of someone running entirely on will, because the body had sent its last available signal and gotten no response. Lucien was at the far end of the hall. He was standing with the stillness he always had, hands in his jacket pockets, watching his people work with the composed attention of a man observing an operation he'd planned carefully and was satisfied to see executing correctly. He looked like a man at a presentation. He looked like a man who'd already won. She stepped back around the corridor edge before anyone saw her. Her mind was running fast and cold. Adrian's position, the 6 visible men, the 2 shooters in the east corridor, his people, his 7, or some of them. The building layout as she'd mapped it in the days of walking, the timing the federal contact had given her, within the hour. She didn't know how long she'd been in the tunnel. She didn't know how long the call had taken. She looked at the phone in her hand, and there was no clock on the home screen because it was a one-use encrypted device, and whoever had designed it hadn't considered that the person using it might need to know what time it was. She needed to keep Adrian alive for some amount of time she couldn't calculate. She needed to keep herself alive to do it. She moved down the side corridor, fast and low, heading for the east passage where the return fire was coming from. She came around the corner with her hands up and said, "Don't shoot," before she'd fully cleared the angle, which was a significant act of faith in people she'd known for 4 days. Damon was there, behind an overturned credenza that had become a barricade, a laceration on his head freshly reopened, one of his 6 sutures gone. Beside him, a man she knew only by face, one of Adrian's from the first day. She'd seen him in the corridor outside the medical room. Damon looked at her the way people look at things that shouldn't be there. "You went out the tunnel," he said. "I came back." "Why?" "Because I made a call, and now I need to buy time." She moved behind the credenza and got low. "How many of you are left?" "Here? Us 2, 3 more on the upper level, but they're cut off." He looked at the hall angle. "They have Adrian." "I know, he's been hit. The wound site. He needs the pressure reduced or he'll bleed into the cavity again." She looked at the man beside Damon. "What's your name?" "Carr." "Carr. How does this building's power work? Main breaker. Where is it?" Carr looked at her. He was maybe 25, and he had the specific young man's face of someone trying to calibrate whether the question was serious. It was. "Utility room off the kitchen. Why?" She looked at Damon. "If the lights go out, can your 3 on the upper level move?" Damon's eyes sharpened. "Depends how long the lights are out." 30 seconds. "Can they move and make noise doing it? Enough noise to sound like a full approach from above?" He looked at her for a moment. "You want them to think we have more people than we do." "I want Lucien's people looking at the ceiling for 30 seconds. She held Damon's gaze. "That's all I need." "For what?" She didn't answer that. She looked at Carr. "How do I get to the utility room from here without going through the main hall?" He told her. She went. The utility room was exactly where Carr said it was. A door off the back side of the kitchen, unlocked, the breaker panel on the east wall. She stood in front of it with the flashlight and read the panel because doing this wrong meant nothing came back on and she needed it to come back on. She found the main. She put her hand on it. She counted to 10. She needed Damon's people to be in position, and she had no way to coordinate it. And 10 was an arbitrary number that might be too short or too long, and she counted it anyway, and then she threw the breaker. The building went dark. For 2 seconds, the dark was total. No generator, no emergency lighting, nothing. She'd been expecting the generator and then realized this was the main building panel. The panic room generator was on a separate line, and Lucien's people wouldn't know that. She heard it from where she stood. Above, from the upper level, sudden and concussive. Something being thrown, something falling, heavy footsteps moving fast and deliberate. Damon's 3, making it sound like a wall coming down. She threw the breaker back. Lights. The hall filled with light, and she was already moving, back out of the utility room, back through the kitchen, back toward the main hall from the north approach. The angle Lucien's people would not be watching because they'd all looked up at the ceiling. She came into the hall, and she saw it. 4 of the 6 had repositioned toward the east and upper angles. The 2 holding Adrian had turned. Adrian himself had used the movement to shift his weight off the man on his left, and the man on his left had let him, because the man's attention was on the ceiling. She was across the hall in 6 steps. She reached Adrian's right side and got her shoulder under his arm before anyone fully processed what was happening, and he took the transfer of weight with the exhale of a man whose options had just expanded by exactly 1. "Can you walk?" she said very quietly. "Yes," he said, which she was about 60% sure was true. They moved. The 2 men holding him reacted. She heard the shout, heard the repositioning, and from the east corridor, Damon opened fire again. Not at anyone specific, just enough noise and motion to make the geometry wrong for a clean shot. They made the corridor. She got Adrian into it and kept moving, kept his weight across her shoulders, felt the wet of his wound against her side through both their clothing. "Stairs," she said. "Right." "Where are we going?" "There's a room." He stopped, breathed, started again. "Second floor, north end, window access to the outer roof. Lower drop than the ground level." They went for the stairs. He made them. She didn't know how because she could feel what it cost him with every step, the specific tension of a body trying to accomplish something the mechanics no longer fully supported. Each step up was a decision remade. She kept her shoulder under his arm, and she kept moving because stopping was worse than moving, and the sound behind them was getting organized again. Second floor, north end. The door he meant was locked, and he gave her a 4-digit code, and she punched it with her free hand while he leaned against the wall beside her and breathed through something she wasn't going to name. The door opened. Inside, a narrow room, almost a passage, with a window at the far end that looked out onto the lower section of roof. The extended wing of the building, single story on this side, a 12-foot drop to the garden below. Not ideal. Manageable. She got the window open. Cold air. The particular smell of the lake, farther than she could see, and the smell of wet stone and approaching morning. She looked at Adrian. He was looking at the window with the expression of a man taking accurate stock of a situation he doesn't love. "I'll go first," he said. "Absolutely not. You go second. I go first. I position, you come through, and I manage the landing." She met his eyes. Surgeon's orders. Something crossed his face, the ghost of it again, that almost smile. She went through the window. The roof section was pitched slightly and she navigated it fast, got to the edge, assessed the drop. 12 feet to grass, the garden below dark, no visible hostiles on this side. She looked back and Adrian was already through the window, moving with the controlled damage management of someone who had run out of alternatives, and she talked him to the edge and said, "Bend your knees and go right." And he dropped. She dropped after him. The impact ran up through her feet and shins, and she was on her knees for a second in the wet grass and then up, and he was up too, upright, which was what mattered, though the sound he made getting there was something she was going to catalog and deal with as soon as there was time. They moved away from the building into the dark of the garden. Behind them and above, through the windows of the north side, she could see light moving, flashlights, people searching. She heard a door open somewhere. She got them to the far edge of the garden, to the shadow of the perimeter wall, and they stopped. He was leaning against the stone, one hand flat on it for support, and she got her hands on his wound site and pressed, and he made a sound that was not the controlled non-sound she'd come to expect from him. "How bad?" he said. She couldn't see well enough in the dark. She felt the damage by pressure and response. "Manageable," she said. "Right now, it needs to stay compressed." She took his hand and put it where hers was. "Hold this. Hard." He held it. They stayed still. Her heart was loud in her own ears. The sound from the building had reorganized again to... She could hear it finding structure, Lucien's people, recovering from the disruption and rebuilding the search pattern. "The call went through," she said quietly. Adrian looked at her. "Meridian files are being pulled. Federal response..." She chose her words. "Coming. I don't know exactly when." He was quiet for a moment. "How long were you in that tunnel?"
"Long enough."
"Kaylin." The first time he'd used her name since the panic room. It landed differently out here, in the dark and the cold, with his blood on her hands. "How long?" She looked at him. "I don't know," she said. "That's honest. I don't know." He closed his eyes for one breath. 2. Then he opened them and looked at the building, and she watched him assemble something internal. The way she'd watched him assemble things since the trauma table. This particular quality of someone collecting distributed will from everywhere it had scattered and bringing it back to center. Lucien will come out here when he finishes inside, he said. He won't stop at the wall. He has resources beyond this property. I know. If the federal window is longer than we have, I know, she said again. He looked at her. You went back into that tunnel. Yes. Why? She kept her eyes on the building, the flashlights moving in the windows, the shape of the search pattern tightening. Because the work wasn't finished, she said. He was quiet. She could feel his breathing against her shoulder, the controlled steadiness of it, the effort underneath. Then, from the front of the building, the approach lane, the long gravel drive she'd arrived on days ago in the back of an SUV, she heard it. Engines. Multiple. Not the sound of one vehicle or two, but the sound of a convoy, moving fast and without the particular courtesy of minimizing their presence. She felt Adrian go still beside her. Lights. Red and blue, flooding the property's front face, painting the stone walls in rotating color. The specific frequency of federal vehicles, of organized approach, of something arriving with the authority to end a thing. Within the hour, the voice had said. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, but Adrian's hand was suddenly gripping her arm, not panicked, but urgent. The grip of someone who has just seen something she hasn't. She looked where he was looking. The garden's far gate, the one in the perimeter wall that she hadn't mapped because it was on the south side and she'd focused north. It was open. And Lucien Vale was walking through it, unhurried, with two men behind him and a bag in one hand. A bag the size of a hard drive case, the size of something you grabbed on your way out of a building when federal lights appeared on the drive. He hadn't run. He'd had a plan. He'd always had a plan. And he was 40 meters away and moving away from the estate, and away from the arriving vehicles, and away from everything the next 60 minutes was going to bring down on this property. Adrian was already moving, away from the wall, toward the gate, across open ground in the dark, one hand pressed to his own wound, and the other carrying nothing because somewhere in the last 20 minutes he'd lost the gun. Adrian! He didn't stop. She looked at Lucien's retreating figure. She looked at Adrian crossing the garden, closing the distance, running on something that wasn't adrenaline anymore, and wasn't will, and wasn't anything she had a medical name for. She ran after him. The grass was wet, and the dark was imperfect, and Lucien heard them at 30 meters. She saw him register it, turn, see Adrian coming, and in the moment before his two men reacted, she saw something on Lucien Vale's face that she had not seen there before. Not fear exactly, something that in another man she would have called the end of confidence. One of his men moved toward Adrian, and Adrian hit him with the specific economy of someone who has done violence for long enough that it no longer requires thought. Two movements, controlled and precise. And the man was down and Adrian was still moving, and the gap between him and Lucien was closing to 20 meters, and then 15. And then Lucien's second man raised his weapon. Kaylin hit the man from the side. She had no training for it. She had the knife, and she had the trajectory, and she had the knowledge from 8 years in trauma rooms of exactly where the human body is most structurally vulnerable to sudden lateral force, and she used all three. And they went down together in the wet grass, and she got clear, and the gun had skittered away in the dark. She looked up. Adrian and Lucien were 10 feet apart. Lucien had his weapon drawn. Adrian had nothing. Between them, 10 feet of dark garden, and the bag in Lucien's left hand, and the red-blue light from the front of the property throwing everything in alternating color. Lucien looked at his cousin. "You're bleeding," he said. "Yes," Adrian said. "You can barely stand." "Also yes." Lucien's eyes went to Kaylin, on the ground, getting up. Then back to Adrian. The weapon was steady in his hand. The specific steadiness of someone who has made the internal decision and is now only waiting on the external execution. "This was always going to end here," Lucius had said. "I know," Adrian said. "You went soft. The operation, the network. You were going to burn it all down." His voice had something in it, not grief exactly, but its structural equivalent. The sound of someone who had decided that feeling the thing was less important than saying the last version of it out loud. 15 years. That's what you were going to throw away. I was going to build something that lasted, Adrian said. You don't understand the difference. I understand the difference cost you everything. Adrian looked at him. In the alternating light, his face was unreadable in the way that very certain things are unreadable. Not because there's nothing there, but because what's there has gone past the point where expression serves any function. Lucien, he said, put it down. Or? Adrian said nothing. He took one step forward, and Lucien Vale, who had planned everything, who had placed men in the right rooms and cut the right communications and orchestrated a thing that should have worked, Lucien Vale made the specific mistake of taking his eyes off Kaylin Mercer for the 2 seconds it took her to cross the ground between them and bring the tactical knife handle first into the back of his weapon hand with the precision of someone who spent their professional life knowing exactly where the structural vulnerabilities of the human hand were located. The gun hit the grass. Lucien turned to look at her with an expression she'd remember for a long time. Pure, clean, absolute surprise. Adrian reached him in the next second. What happened in the 3 seconds after that was not something she watched in detail. She looked at the gate in the perimeter wall, at the dark beyond it, at the bag on the ground where Lucien had dropped it. She picked up the bag. Inside, through the unzipped top, she could see the drives, multiple, labeled in a hand she didn't recognize. She looked up. Adrian was standing over his cousin, who was on the ground. Adrian's hand was against his wound. His face was the color of concrete again, the specific color of someone who had used the last of it and was now standing on the other side of empty. She went to him. She got under his arm before he had to ask. From the front of the property, through the gate, through the wall, in the dark and the wet grass. The sound of doors, voices, authority arriving in numbers. The sound of something ending and something else beginning. Adrian's weight was heavy on her shoulder. I have the drives, she said. He looked down at her hand, at the bag. Something in his face moved. The contact, he started. Already done. She adjusted her grip on him. I told you the call went through. He was quiet for a moment. His breathing was shallow in a way she was closely monitoring. You went back into the tunnel, he said again, like he was still processing it, like it was the part that didn't fit the model he'd built. She looked at the approaching lights, at the shape of what was coming. I wasn't finished, she said. And from beyond the gate, the first federal vehicle came through. The first federal vehicle through the gate was a black SUV that came in fast and stopped hard, gravel spraying, headlights cutting across the wet garden and finding them immediately. 2 people standing in the dark, one of them holding a bag, one of them barely upright. Doors opened. Men came out with weapons up, and voices carrying the specific flat authority of people trained to fill space with command. Down. Hands. Now. Kaylin went to her knees without hesitation. She put the bag down in front of her and kept her hands visible because making that decision fast was how you kept the next 3 seconds from becoming something irreversible. Beside her, Adrian went down slower, not defiance, just the body's honest report on what kneeling cost right now. And she heard the sound he made doing it and filed it and kept her hands up. More vehicles, more doors. The garden was suddenly full of people and light and the particular controlled noise of a large operation finding its positions. A man came toward them, not running, walking, the walk of someone who was in charge and knew it and didn't need to perform it. He was 50, or close to it, with a face that had been weather-tested and come out the other side looking permanently skeptical. He looked at the bag first, then at Adrian, then at Kaylin. Dr. Mercer, he said. Yes. I'm Special Agent Cord Harlan. He didn't offer a hand. She was on her knees with her hands up. You made a call about an hour ago. I did. He looked at the bag. Are those the drives? I believe so. I didn't inventory them. She paused. My patient needs immediate medical attention. He has a compromised surgical repair at the abdominal site, and he's been in an active combat environment for the last, she calculated, 4 hours minimum. He needs a hospital. Harlan looked at Adrian for a long moment. Adrian was looking back at him with the expression of a man who had arrived at the end of something and was not yet sure what the shape of what came next was going to be. Mr. Voss, Harlan said. Agent Harlan. Adrian's voice was steady, quieter than usual, but steady. This is going to be a complicated conversation. I expect it will be. You're going to need a lawyer before most of it happens. I have several. Harlan almost smiled. It was the specific almost smile of someone who had been doing a hard job for a long time and had learned to find the dry edge of things. He looked at Kaylin. We have a medical team with us. They'll take him. He paused. You're coming with me. She looked at Adrian. He was looking at her. In the light, all the light now, the vehicles and the flashlights, and the beginning of the sky going from black to the particular dark gray that came before dawn, his face was readable in a way it almost never had been. The control was still there, but it was thinner than she'd seen it, worn down to something closer to the actual material underneath. Go, he said. The wound needs compression maintained until... Kaylin. She stopped. Go, he said again. Quietly, like a door that had been held open being allowed, finally, to close. She stood up. She picked up the bag and handed it to Harlan because it wasn't hers and never had been. She watched two people from the medical team reach Adrian, and she watched him let them. Let them take his weight, let them move him toward the vehicle, let the next thing begin. She watched until he was in the vehicle and the door was closed. Then she went with Harlan. They took her to a field office in a building in the city that looked like nothing from the outside and was considerably more substantial from the inside. She sat across a table from Harlan and a woman named Reyes. Not a Reyes, a different one, a federal attorney with reading glasses and the specific patience of someone who has done a very great number of interviews. And she talked for 3 hours. She told them everything. Not in the way of someone confessing or performing or trying to manage an outcome, just accurately, sequentially, the way she gave a surgical report. She told them about the trauma bay at 3:17 a.m. and John Doe on the chart and the text that arrived at 2 p.m. and the door coming off the hinges. She told them about Blackwood Estate and the infection and the debridement and the hallways she'd walked to map the exits. She told them about Lucien Vale in the library and the quality of his particular stillness and the moment she understood what it meant. She told them about the panic room and the tunnel and the phone call and going back into the tunnel. Harlan listened to all of it without interrupting. Reyes took notes. When Kaylin finished, Harlan was quiet for a moment. You went back in, he said. Not a question, just the thing he'd landed on. Yes. Why? She looked at the table, at her hands resting on it. There was still blood under her nails. Adrian's from the garden, from pressing on the wound in the dark. She hadn't been offered a chance to clean up yet, and she hadn't asked for one. Because he would have died, she said, and the work would have died with him. The files, the contact, all of it. She looked up. I didn't go back for a person. I went back because the job wasn't finished. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. He had the eyes of someone who had heard a very great number of explanations for a very great number of things, and had developed a precise instrument for measuring the distance between what people said and what was true. He didn't say anything about the distance. He just moved on. The debrief ended at 9 a.m. Reyes gave her a card. Harlan told her there would be more conversations and that she should not leave the state, which was the first time anyone had explicitly told her she was free to go anywhere within it. A federal driver took her back to Logan Square. She sat in the back of the car and watched Chicago come back. The familiar density of it, the specific light of a fall morning on the lakeside. The way the city just kept being itself, regardless of what happened in buildings outside it. She watched it like someone watching a place they've been away from for longer than 4 days. Her apartment door had been replaced. Not well. Whoever had done it had hung it slightly off plumb, and the deadbolt was a different brand than the lock. But it opened and closed and locked, which was the functional requirement. She stood inside for a moment. Everything was where she'd left it. The books above the radiator, the coffee mug on the counter, the particular gray light through the windows that made everything look slightly defeated. She showered. She stood under hot water until the water ran cold, and then she stood in it a little longer, because cold water was something she could feel, and feeling something specific and manageable was what she needed right now. She slept for 14 hours. She went back to St. Vincent's 3 days later. Her department head, a man named Guthrie, who expressed emotion primarily through the precise architecture of his silences, looked at her across his desk for a long time before saying anything. "You were missing for 4 days," he said. "I was." There were questions. "I imagine." "The chart with John Doe. The night of the—" "I can't discuss the specifics," she said. "There's a federal matter. I've been told that much is going to become clear in time." She held Guthrie's gaze. "I didn't violate patient confidentiality. I treated a patient who needed treatment. The rest of it happened to me, not because of any choice I made professionally." Guthrie looked at her for another long silence. He was not, she understood, a man who accepted incomplete information gracefully, but he was also a man who had run a trauma department for 20 years and had learned to read the specific register of people who had been through something and come back carrying it differently. "Take the week," he said. "I'd rather work." Another silence. "Fine," he said, "but I'm putting you on days only until further notice." She went back to work. It helped the way work always helped. It gave her hands something to do, and when her hands had something to do, her mind had somewhere to put its attention. She moved through shifts with the same efficiency she always had, the same economy of movement, the same flat declarative communication style that the nurses had learned to read accurately. She treated patients. She made decisions. She wrote accurate charts. She did not write John Doe on any of them. 2 weeks later, Damon found her. She was leaving her shift at 11 at night, walking to the parking structure through the specific particular smell of a hospital at that hour, industrial cleaner and old coffee and the particular flatness of recirculated air, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned, and he was there. 6 sutures on his head, 2 of them hers, all of them intact. He looked better than the last time she'd seen him. He also looked like a man delivering a message rather than having a conversation, which told her something. "He's asking if he can see you," Damon said. She looked at him for a moment. "How is he?" "The hospital they took him to, federal facility, closed ward. They did a second surgery, repaired what came apart." He paused. "He's asking if he can see you," he said again, because that was the message and he was delivering it faithfully. She looked at the parking structure, at the night, at the space between where she was and where the car was, which was the space between going home and not going home. "Tell him I need a week," she said. Damon nodded. He left. She drove home. The week passed the way weeks pass when they're also something else. Too slowly in the mornings, too quickly in the afternoons, the evenings longer than they had any right to be. She ate, she slept, she went to work. She stood at the window above Logan Square and watched the street and didn't think about what she was doing, which was waiting to understand what she was going to do. On the 7th day, she drove to the address Damon had left on a slip of paper tucked under her windshield wiper at some point she hadn't noticed. It was not Blackwood Estate. That property was currently the subject of a federal preservation order, and she'd seen it in the news in the specific way she'd started scanning news differently, looking for particular words, particular names, reading between the organized language of official statements for the actual shape of what was happening. The shape was this. The trafficking network the drives had documented was being systematically dismantled. 14 arrests in 3 countries, 2 Port Authority officials indicted. A congressional subcommittee had been convened to examine the municipal contracts Adrian had documented. The name Voss appeared in the coverage with a particular careful neutrality that told her the federal conversations were ongoing, and the shape of what Adrian was and wasn't responsible for was still being decided in rooms she didn't have access to. Lucien Vale's name appeared once in a court filing as a defendant in a federal conspiracy case. He had been arrested in the garden at Blackwood Estate. She knew that. She'd been there when it happened. The address Damon had given her was a building on the North Shore and not a house, an apartment in a building that looked unremarkable from the outside. And she understood that unremarkable was probably the current requirement. She went up in an elevator that worked, which felt notable after 3 weeks of the broken one in Logan Square. She knocked. He opened the door himself. He looked different, not healed. It had only been 3 weeks and the body didn't work on that timeline, but different in the way that people look different when they've been through something that relocated them slightly inside themselves. He was thinner. He was wearing ordinary clothes, which she'd never seen him in. Dark jeans, a gray shirt. He looked, for the first time, like a person who existed outside of a crisis. He looked at her the way he always had. The cataloging attention, the quality of someone for whom information was primary currency. But there was something else in it now, something that hadn't been there in the trauma bay, or the estate, or the panic room, or the garden. Something that might have been, in another register, relief. "Dr. Mercer," he said. "You can call me Kaylin," she said. "I've had my hands in your chest. I think we're past titles." He opened the door wider. She went in. The apartment was spare in the way of temporary places. Furniture that was functional and little else. A window with a view of the lake, a kitchen that had coffee made, and nothing else visible in the way of domestic life. She stood in the middle of the main room and he stood near the window, and there was a long moment where neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of conversation. "How is the repair?" she said finally. "Their surgeon was competent." A pause. "Not as fast as you." "Speed isn't the primary metric." "No, but it communicates something about certainty." He looked at her. "The infection resolved. The secondary surgery closed what came open in the garden. They tell me full recovery in 4 to 6 weeks." "6," she said. "Don't trust 4." "I'm told that regularly." She looked at the window, at the lake beyond it, gray-green in the November light, moving the way it always moved, without reference to anything that happened on the shore. She'd always found that specific quality of large bodies of water either comforting or devastating depending on what she needed. Right now it was comforting. "The federal situation," she said, "is ongoing." He said it without evasion and without the careful management of information she'd come to expect. "I have attorneys, I have the cooperation I offered before any of this began. The documentation I built was specific about my own role in the organization's history. I didn't architect a defense that made me innocent. I architected a record that was accurate." He was quiet for a moment. "There will be consequences. Some of them are already determined. Others are still being negotiated." "Consequences like?" "Like the organization in its current form ceases to exist. The shipping operations, the legitimate ones, and there were more of them than anyone wants to credit right now, are being restructured under federal oversight. Some properties, some accounts." He looked at the lake. "Not the worst outcome. You're describing losing most of what you built. I'm describing losing the parts that needed to go." He turned from the window and looked at her. "The trafficking network is functionally destroyed. 14 people who were moving human beings across 4 international routes are in custody. The Port Authority contacts who were enabling it are facing prosecution." He paused. "I built something that did harm, and I spent 3 years trying to find a way to end the harm without simply handing it to someone worse. Whether that counts for anything is a conversation I've had with federal attorneys and am not resolved on." She looked at him. "Does it count to you?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally. "That's an honest answer. I know what I intended. I know the cost of the distance between intention and result." He met her eyes. "I know that the outcome is better than it would have been if I died on your table at St. Vincent's." "That's a low bar. Most honest bars are." She almost laughed. She didn't quite. She looked at the coffee on the counter. "Can I?" she said. "Please." She poured a cup and stood at the counter with it and held the warmth of it in both hands. He stayed near the window. The space between them was the same space it had always been. Some quality of it that she hadn't been able to name since the trauma bay and still couldn't, but had stopped trying to name it as something it wasn't. "I owe you a debt that I can't calculate," he said, "and I want to—" "Don't," she said. He stopped. "I know what you're going to offer," she said. "Money, a new place, some arrangement that makes the debt into a transaction so you can file it correctly." She looked at him over the coffee. "I don't want it." "Then what do you want?" She considered the question. She considered it genuinely, with the same attention she gave to a complicated diagnosis, not looking for the answer she was supposed to give, but the one that was actually true. "I want my student loans to eventually end," she said. "I want the elevator in my building to be fixed. I want to do my job without anyone taking my door off its hinges. She looked at him. I want to know that the people whose names were on those drives are safe, that what I went into that tunnel for actually held. It held, he said, quietly, with the particular weight of someone stating a fact they had paid for personally. She nodded. She drank the coffee. Outside the window, the lake moved the way the lake always moved, gray-green and indifferent and continuous. There's something I need to tell you, he said. She waited. The night you first operated on me, at St. Vincent's. He looked at his hands, a gesture she hadn't seen from him before, downward rather than outward. Something turned inward. When the men brought me in, I knew I was going to survive it. Not from optimism, from the way you moved when you came across that room. He paused. I've been in situations where I had to read people's competence under pressure very quickly. It's a specific skill. I read you in about 10 seconds. And I was right. He looked up. But I also... He stopped. Something in his face moved through several things and came out the other side quieter. I had no right to bring you into this, the way it happened, the men at your door, the tunnel. He held her gaze. I would like to tell you that I would have chosen differently if I had had the option. I think that's probably true, but you were the option I had, and I used it, and the cost of that was yours. She was quiet for a moment. The cost of that was mine, she agreed, and I paid it. She set down the coffee cup. And then I made decisions about it, in the tunnel and again at the gate. She looked at him steadily. Those were mine too. You don't get to own them. He looked at her. The weight of the exchange settled. No, he said. I suppose I don't. She picked up the coffee again. Outside, a boat was moving across the lake, very far out, its shape small against the gray water. She watched it for a moment. The apartment on the north shore, she said. Is it going to be here for a while? He understood what she was asking. As long as the federal process requires, yes. Several months, minimum. She nodded. I might need someone to consult on the recovery, she said. Wound care. Making sure the repair stays intact. Someone who can read the specific signs. She kept her eyes on the lake. Not formally, just someone who knows what they're looking at. She heard the quality of his silence change. That would be useful, he said. It would be medical, she said. Of course, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the same attention he always had. The cataloging, the measuring, but overlaid now with something that had no professional name and wasn't trying to acquire one. I'm going to finish this coffee, she said, and then I'm going to go home. And in a few days I'll come back and look at the suture line. She held his gaze. And we'll see what the healing looks like. He nodded. It was a small nod, almost nothing, but it was the kind of nod that meant a great deal had been understood in very few words. She finished the coffee. She rinsed the cup and set it in the rack beside the sink, a small automatic gesture, the kind you make in a place you intend to return to. And she picked up her coat and she went to the door. She had her hand on the frame when he said her name. Not doctor, just Kaylin. The way he'd said it in the panic room and in the garden, the way that sounded like it had been learned rather than assumed. She turned. He was standing near the window with the gray lake behind him and the November light on his face, and he looked like what he was, a man who had built a kingdom on wrong foundations and burned most of it down himself, and was standing in the aftermath trying to understand what the ground beneath it was actually made of. He looked like someone who wasn't finished yet. Thank you, he said. Not for the surgery, not for the tunnel, for something larger and more specific than either of those things, and they both knew it. She looked at him for a moment, at the window, at the lake behind him that kept moving regardless. Don't tear the sutures, she said. She went out the door. In the elevator on the way down, she stood and looked at her reflection in the metal panel and saw what she always saw, a face that was tired in the specific chronic way of people who chose work that didn't end, eyes that were clear, hands that were still. The same hands that had worked on a man who refused his name on a table at 3:17 in the morning and started a sequence of events that she was still inside of, would be inside of for a while yet, in ways she was only beginning to map. The elevator opened. She walked out into the lobby and through the front door and into November Chicago, which was cold and bright and completely itself. The city doing what cities do, moving, layering, generating the next moment on top of the last without pausing to mark the seam. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her hands in her coat pockets. She thought about the elevator in her building, which was still broken. She thought about Guthrie putting her on day shifts only until further notice, which was irritating but not wrong. She thought about the chart at St. Vincent's where she'd written John Doe, which was now part of a federal evidentiary record that she would probably have to testify to at some point in the next year. She thought about a tunnel 60 meters long in the dark and what it felt like to turn around and go back into it. She thought about Damon's 6 sutures, all of them intact when she'd seen him last. She walked to her car. She got in. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, looking at the street, at the particular ordinary late morning life of the city that just kept going. The woman pushing a stroller, the delivery truck double parked with its hazards on, the coffee place on the corner with the handwritten sign in the window that she'd driven past 100 times without stopping. She started the car. She had a shift tomorrow at 7. There would be people who needed their lives saved, and she would be there to do it, which was the most stable thing she knew about herself and had been since she was 22 years old in her first year of medical school, and a man had come in with a hunting accident, and she had watched the attending do the impossible with calm hands and understood with the absolute clarity of a true thing recognized that this was what her hands were for. That hadn't changed. Everything else had changed in layers. Her apartment, her door, her understanding of what people were capable of, and what the distance was between a man's worst history and his best intention. Her understanding of what she was capable of in 60 meters of dark, with a phone and a set of credentials and a decision to make. She pulled out into traffic. In a building on the North Shore, a man she'd kept alive against considerable odds was standing at a window looking at a lake that didn't care about any of it, and somewhere in the next weeks and months the shape of what came next would become clearer, the way the shape of things always becomes clearer after the immediate crisis passes and the body stops running on the specific fuel of emergency and starts running on the longer, slower fuel of living. She would look at the suture line in a few days. She would read the healing. She knew how to read healing. It never looked like she expected. It always surprised her. The body's insistence on continuance, on closing what had been opened, on the slow, determined biology of repair. She'd spent 8 years watching it happen, and it still surprised her every time. That was the thing about healing. You could facilitate it. You could create the right conditions, remove the obstacles, give it what it needed. But you couldn't do it for someone. You couldn't reach into the tissue and force the cells to knit. The body decided. The body chose. And it did, almost always, choose to continue. She drove south through the city, past the familiar streets toward Logan Square, and the broken elevator and the coffee mug on the counter and the books above the radiator, toward the apartment that looked like her life, and now also like the before of something she was still standing at the beginning of. The lake was behind her now, invisible, but she knew it was there the way you know what you can't see, by the quality of the light it puts into the air, by the particular cold it sends through the city's streets, by the sense of something vast and continuous at the edge of everything, moving without end, indifferent and immense, and in its own way utterly reliable. She drove toward home.